The title to this presentation is to be Biblical Theology of Vulnerable Missions for Scripture and the Mission of God. Before going on, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Jim Harries. I'm here in Kenya. I've lived in East Africa for 33 years. Initially from the UK, was called in 1987 to give my life in service to God in the majority world. Long story, of course. I thought I'd be doing agriculture. God directed me rather to Bible teaching, in a way because I realized that the inputs I'd received from the reality of Africa, about the reality of Africa while in UK, were in a sense misleading, and what was really going to be helpful for people, I realized, was God's word more than my agricultural technology. So I've been here in East Africa where I'm now, in the village I'm living in now, since 1993. I generally say I have four kinds of ministry that I do, in no particular order. One is I'm officially under the umbrella of the Coptic Orthodox Church, so I do some prayer for the sick here, preaching, Bible teaching and so forth. Secondly, research and writing. Thirdly, I do a lot of visiting of indigenous churches, many of whom I've had relationships with well over 20 years, sharing God's word with them, really just participating in what they're doing, fellowshipping together with them. Fourthly, my home is in an African village. My home language is the Luo language, to some extent Swahili. At the home, I look after between 8 and 14 orphan children at any one time. I'm single. There's a house mother there who has a day-to-day responsibility for that work. My focus in advocacy for mission has been for a long time on vulnerable mission. I came across the principles of vulnerable mission, if you like, following my 3 years in Zambia, at which point I realized that it was very easy for me as a foreign missionary to get people's interest in almost any project I might want to engage in, as long as the project was subsidized and the people concerned were going to benefit financially from what I was doing. I also realized the massive gap between the way we hear many African people articulate themselves in English and the way they hear each other articulate themselves in indigenous languages. So on coming to Kenya in 1993, I'd set my course as being one in which I wanted to make sure my ministry was going to be in indigenous languages, and that I was not going to build dependency on outside resources. Now, the children I look after at home, I will admit that's my home runs on money I get from the UK. But in relationship with other churches and other ministries that I've also talked about, those relationships are not based on outside funds. If I go to a particular activity, I will donate no more than anybody else to whatever is going on, as a means of ensuring that I don't create outside dependency. In terms of language, it makes less and less sense for me to engage with African people using English when I realize what happens in the process of my trying to understand their English on the basis of my background, and the very implications of English as being a language that communicates, let's say in a sense, non-understanding. So the focus for my presentation I want to give here is on Africa. Now, you've heard I'm particularly East Africa based. I'm not so much wanting to tell you, though, this is what Africans are like. I'm seeking to address Western people. I think we need to get our own act in order in mission. It's about properly presenting God's word in a godly way is what I want to talk about, rather than making them what they ought to be or who they ought to be. The latter, in a sense, is what God does if we are true to Him in what He wants us to do and how He wants us to do it. So I want to talk about cross-cultural mission, reaching people, in essence, who are different from us. Now, the way that connects, it seems to me, in the Western world is in what we call the issue of racism. That concept of racism has become the defining way of looking within the Western world at how, say, native Westerners, otherwise whites, relate to people of other ethnicity. So, what is racism? I don't think it is recognizing that other people are different, but it's hating people because they're different. Now, having said that, solutions to the issue of racism, I think, tend to be denying difference. The reason we deny difference, it's actually hard to relate freely to people you don't know in another way. If there is an ethnicity or a community of people you're not familiar with, then it's hard not to treat them as if they're your own people. That's kind of the default you go into. So then, very quickly, not being racist comes to be treating people of a different ethnicity, of a big different background, as if they're one of us. Now, not being racist is not hating. So what is it to not hate? Well, let me suggest that money doesn't buy your way out of hatred. In other words, not hating, or in other words, loving people, I want to suggest is not about giving them money. I'm aware that this is the way the debate is often framed in the US. Often people look statistically at the income of, say, blacks in America compared to whites in America. And I think someone recently said there was, a small fraction, the income of blacks was a small fraction of that of whites on average. And certainly the wealth of blacks in America was a certain fraction of that of whites on average. If we consider that to be the defining factor that determines whether one is racist or not, I think we've become subject to a reasoning that is really not very Christian, but is more likely to be secular. It's not about giving money, I want to suggest. It's about giving my all. And I draw here Matthew 16:24-26. He who saves his life will lose it. He who loses his life for my sake will save it, said Jesus. So when we're talking about relating to non-Western people, let's say in a sense, I think what we need is some people who are prepared to give their all and others to support them in doing that, rather than everybody giving a little. The problem with partially giving yourself is it can be difficult to distinguish that from exploiting the people to whom you are partially giving yourself. I think mission is about dependence. I don't mean dependence of the people you're reaching on the West. I mean dependence of the missionary on the people they're reaching. Even if I take the example, the orphan children I look after, I started taking in orphans in 1997. On average, I've had about 12 children live with me. You might ask what their age is. Well, they come in small and they go when they're big. So the ages between 0, actually, or 1, and about 20. How to live with those orphans? I mean, it's tempting from the Western kind of way of thinking to provide a lot for them. Give them this, give them that, give them the best. But frankly, that is an abnormal way of raising kids. Raising kids is give and take. Certainly in Africa. I don't know what's happening in the West these days. depending on them, even as kids. In other words, they have assignments they have to do, they have work to do in order to keep the household running. And then what about the future? I mean, am I giving them my time to get them up to speed and then off they go, or is my commitment to them ongoing? And if my commitment to them is ongoing, is their commitment to me ongoing? Let's say love has to be mutual. Now, of course, we extend love to people. Initially, of course, God extends love to us. He's the one who loves us while we are sinners. We don't start by loving Him. When He loves us, what is our response? What should be our response? Well, our response should be to love Him back. So yes, a missionary extends love. There's this thought that true grace expects no return. Now, a book by John Barclay, some of you might have come across, questions that notion in terms of its role in tradition and finds it to be a very modern notion. Giving, I think, really ought to make one dependent on the people to whom one is giving. I mean, if we take biblical examples, Isaiah, I mean, did Isaiah stand tall and independently of the Jerusalem to whom he was prophesying? No. Jeremiah, did Jeremiah kind of parachute in, share the words that he had and parachute out? Perhaps he would have liked to, in another sense, but no way. He was very much a part of the kingdom of Judah at that time and subject to its vagaries. And when the king wanted to throw him into a hole in the ground, that's where he went. David, a great king, a very powerful man, radically dependent on the people to whom he was witnessing, because David was a man whose heart was close to God. He was witnessing to his subjects, I think, very effectively, even through his sin. But it wasn't a smooth journey. And his dependence on the people to whom he was witnessing was often very evident, particularly in the case of Absalom, who led a rebellion. So the dependence of the missionary, the servant of God, the messenger of God, on the people whom they are reaching has been very normal up to the time of the modern missionary. So we could say the West has failed. Now, I don't mean that as an accusation. We all fail. We've been strong on take this. We've been strong on giving. We've not been strong on vulnerability. We've not been strong on being broken. Now, what we refer to as vulnerable mission that I already talked about, using local languages, using local resources in your ministry. Some ask, why do you call it vulnerable? Because it leaves you vulnerable to failure. Resources, if you're the one providing it, people will keep doing what you want them to do as long as the resources are there. If you don't have resources, you're vulnerable to people rejecting you. So, being vulnerable, being broken is tough. It's foolish. Now, again, not that we need to overexpose ourselves. I mean, there's folly has to come in hand with also wisdom in the appropriate way. So what has been, we could say, we could ask the problem of the West. Perhaps the problem has been that we know how. Now, of course, that's what we thought was the solution. Not the problem, but the solution. But yet, we know how is also the problem. This is linked, of course, to this notion of I am superior. Now, I don't live in North America. I don't know how these English terms are interpreted there. I gather that in certain circles, this notion about whites being superior is something that people are trying to say, no, you're not superior. In another sense, denying our superiority while living on the basis that we are superior is a kind of hypocrisy. So in a sense, we need to acknowledge the gifts that we have and acknowledge how we've got them. How do we get to be who we are today, if not through the influence of the gospel on our ancestors over many generations? But what I want to ask is that the beginning and end of our faith? Do we go on to mission in Africa because we have better ways to share with African people than the ways they knew before? And is that it? Medical mission. I very much appreciate medical mission in many, many ways. But medical mission also is an epitome, in a sense, of the thing that I'm here describing, of doing what you do on the basis of an underlying notion that we know better. Which, in a sense, is I want to be wanted. Kind of an approach to medical mission generally puts the foreigner in the middle and others dependent on them. And when the money flows, they become the source of the funds, the source of interest, the source of power, the focus of power. Which is, as I say, I'm not denying the value of that and the importance of that. But I am suggesting that there also ought to be another approach by other missionaries, perhaps, that sidestep these issues of being in control and being in power and having everything revolve around the Westerner. We model ourselves on Jesus. Jesus healed a lot of people. Does that mean that medical mission is therefore justified? Well, how did Jesus heal? Well, we talk about miracles. Miracles, I think we need to realize, in biblical terms, are not counter-scientific events or supernatural events. They are amazing events. They are events that bring amazing outcomes, that makes people happy to see a change that's incurred in someone else's life. Miracles are signs. 22 times the King James Version translates semeion as miracle. Only 8 times does it translate dunamis as miracle. Note that both these Greek terms have nothing to do with a dualistic conception of there's a mechanical world and a God interfering in it or coming into it supernaturally. And certainly there's no notion here of being counter-scientific. Healing in the New Testament is by faith, not by bringing donor money and not by foreign technology. So the medical mission approach is not wrong, but is limited. It limits the missionary. It kind of confines the missionary to a role of being the center of power and influence, and makes it difficult for the missionary in their ministry to listen closely to what the people would actually be doing themselves. We could take this notion of the dependency of the missionary further. Jesus, Paul, Peter, David, all were very dependent on the people they were reaching. Nowadays, as Westerners, we tend to make ourselves independent. I mean, if we need a house help, we pay them. We live in a separate place. We depend on our own families. All that we depend on local people for, very often, is glowing reports. We do need them to back what we're doing, to support what we're doing, particularly when it comes to donors wanting to be sure that their finance is being well used. So there is that dependence, though it's a very limited dependence, and even that dependence can cut both ways. if you are depending on local people to justify your receipt of funds, your business is about funding. And they do retain, or someone retains, a lever on your activities, which they can also use in a contrary way if they so desire. And if your relationship with them has been based really entirely on finance, when things go wrong, well, your role comes to an end. So I suggested that our problem is that we know how. So maybe the answer is we should not know how. How do you not know how? It takes time. We're pretty convinced, I think, many Westerners are pretty convinced that they know how. And it takes a while to realize that they don't know how. It took me many years, and it was hard work. It was hard work particularly because the message coming from my supporters, I don't mean individuals or churches, but my supporting country, was that we know how, tell them, help them with what we know, because they're ignorant, they don't know. We're the ones who have the solution in our superior technology and science and education. What about an alternative, an incarnation? Now, the term incarnation itself, I struggle with a little bit because we use it for Jesus coming into the world. And that implies that a missionary incarnating is like God coming into the world, when we Western people, we're not God. Sometimes in the way we behave, it's like we are. And in a way, that's what Westerners have done. They've usurped the role of God. We've usurped the role of God in our own society, and we continue to usurp the role of God when we go into other societies. I remember hearing a report, or was I reading it, I don't know, of a young American who imagined himself going back into history. And on the basis of what we now know, how he would very quickly engage with those people, with that community in which he found himself way back in the history of Europe, you know. And my hearing or reading of him had me realize that in his own understanding, he would very soon be a widely respected leader in that community, because he would demonstrate that he had superior knowledge by doing this and that, and by showing this and that, some scientific trick, you know. That's probably what I used to think also when I came to Africa. I thought, well, I'm just so more competent than these people here. It didn't work. It didn't work. 18 years I spent teaching the Bible by extension, using the local language, traveling by bicycle to classes in the vicinity. Typically the classes were held in different churches. We would go to church on a Sunday and tell them we'd like to teach the Bible, and 20 people would put their hand up saying yes, they want to come along, and then maybe 4 would show up. And at the end of the meeting they kind of would hint, well, is there any money? Second week, those 4 might be there again, but a bit delayed and a bit more forthright in asking where the money is. And the third week, 3 come up and they're half an hour late. And after about 6 weeks, we hit 0. What was going on? I kept going, realizing many ways that what I was doing wasn't going to work. But I didn't want to give up. So I kept going to find out what was actually happening. Those 18 years of cycling to a location, sitting there waiting for students, myself being drowsy often, it was hot in the middle of the day, students weren't motivated and so forth. Let's say in a sense, of course, my categories were all wrong. I was trying to share on the basis of theology I'd learned in the UK. The African people I was engaging with were in a totally different world in their own conceptions. I mean, I could try and say what was that world, but again, if I try and articulate their world in English, that's problematic in its own way, because you will hear what I say. With respect to, assuming my listeners are native English speakers, with respect to your own understanding from English. I mean, I could say things like witchcraft, things like ancestors, things like spirits, The power was the issues to these people. But even as I say those things in English, I'm missing the point, because the categories that they live by are just vastly different from the categories we live by. And if we can't engage correctly with their categories, how can we pretend? How can we begin to really, become a part of what's going on, rather than an abrasive foreign kind of input? Much theological education in Africa goes on in European languages, in English particularly. I taught for many years at an English language Bible teaching program, Bible college here in Western Kenya. It became more and more difficult as I became familiar with local languages and local thought forms to stand there and teach things that came from a different world, made less and less sense. But that was difficult for students, because they knew that their accreditation depended on them being able to communicate theology as if they were American, as if they were British. So the best teacher for that school in many respects was the fresh Westerner who just taught in Africa using English as if they were back in the US, which made theological education in Africa a bit like a ticket to the US, because until you got to the US, to the West, all those sectors within Africa that were very, very Western, your theological education doesn't have a fit to local context. I think I can say it's very common for people engaging in all kinds of projects in Africa for their work and their project to continue as long as the subsidy is there. Now, we tend to have different ways of justifying that. Like, we have to subsidize at the beginning to convince the people of the value of what we're doing, and then once they've seen the value of it, then they will invest their own resources into the project or the activity that we're engaged in. I think often it doesn't work that way in practice. What we do, in effect, what you easily end up doing by bringing a subsidy is encouraging lies and, in a sense, buying untruth, because when there's a subsidy or potential subsidy coming, I mean, he's a fool who tells the person, the donor, or the person linking with the donor, the truth. No, you please them. Interestingly, in the life of Jesus, I think I can say we have no record of Jesus making a donation. Certainly not a donation that he's received by fundraising in a foreign part. Paul, people look at the life of Paul and say, well, Paul made a collection for Jerusalem. Now, we need to note that the collection for Jerusalem was a collection from the Gentiles for his own people. It would be an equivalent of my being here in Africa and saying my church in the UK, my supporting church in the UK needs help. So collecting money from African people to take to the UK. Now, I think that's kind of okay. I don't know how successful such a project will be in today's world, but that's very different from a missionary collecting funds over there to bring them to Africa to hand out to churches that they're involved in planting. So how did Jesus get the finance he needed? How did he get his food? Well, Luke 8 chapter 3 gives us a clue. From local women. Local women supported Jesus. Intriguing. Why local women? Well, let me put it this way. In traditional communities, there's a sense in which many local women, now not all, are not really big power brokers. Those non-power brokers kept Jesus' ministry going. They didn't have a vested interest in his doing ministry in a particular way, a vested financial interest. So let's go back into the West again. As I say, I suggest that the equivalent to intercultural mission in Africa that's going on in the West revolves around the issue of race. We have foreigners living within the West, people of different races, of people different ethnicities. How well are we doing in relating to them? Well, from the appearance as an outsider, not very well. In terms of what the media tells me that is happening, say in the US these days, we're not doing very well. We hear of riots, we hear of disputes, we hear of people considering themselves not done well too. I suggest, though, that the means by which racism is these days being tackled in the West is based on the same foundation as has been the wrong kind of mission in Africa and in the majority world. It's a mission or an approach based on, we have power, we'll share that power with you, we'll share our money with you, we'll make sure you're not abused, we share our superiority with you on our terms. To get it right, I think we need to switch from that approach of we have something better to share with you to, yes, we have God to share with you. It's about love. It's not about rights. Now let me just put in a quick plug here for a book just coming to press now. How Western Anti-Racism Harms Africa and How We Can Do Better, that looks at these issues from the perspective of the effect of anti-racism in the West on the prospects for the continent of Africa. Thank you very much.